Welcome everybody to the second talk in our series, which has been entitled Promoting Community Awareness and Adaptation to Climate Change Challenges. The series, as you would have noticed from the promotion, is a partnership really between the 2030 Yea Community Energy and the Yea Wetlands Discovery Centre, and importantly, basically, the series has been sponsored by the Victorian Government through the Hume regional area. My name is Frank Larkins. I am a member of the executive here of the Wetlands Discovery Centre, and I will chair the meeting tonight. We've got really structured in two presentations. There's a shorter presentation from Andy McCarthy, who is the CEO of the RACV Solar, and I certainly want to thank RAC Solar and David in particular for providing the demonstration Tesla vehicle out there viewing tonight. And as we all, I think, appreciate that electric vehicles are undoubtedly the way of the future. And after Andy has spoken, I will then introduce Dr. Saul Griffith, and he will, in fact, provide the main talk for this evening. And so I'll reserve my remarks until I introduce him. But so first up, Andy, I think you can't see him here at the moment, but he was there before. Andy is on video, and thank you very much indeed for coming in on Zoom. I think he's got 2 or 3 slides he wishes to present. And so, Andy, while I can't see you at the moment, but I invite you to address us both here and our Zooming colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Frank, can everyone hear me there?
Yes, that's all good.
Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay, great start. Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight, and also a pleasure to be the warm-up act to Saul Griffith, who I'm an unashamed fanboy of. Living in the Latrobe Valley, there are days where you feel like this transition is not going to happen, and then I come home and read the big switch and I feel like everything's okay in the world. So it's a real pleasure to be here tonight and to talk about some of the journey that we've been on, specifically in the Latrobe Valley, some of the wins and challenging days that we've had in the past, and some of the work that we've done to contribute to the energy transition. And also specifically my area will be some of the work we've done with 2030 Yea and some of the initiatives we've delivered, and some of the things we plan on doing, which we've taken a lot of inspiration from Saul's ideas as well. So really looking forward to the evening, and pleasure to kick it off. Okay, so waiting for my screen to move over. Of course, it doesn't work when you're actually doing the presentation. Have you still got the original slide up there, Frank? Oh, there we go. Okay, so just going to quickly touch on the journey that we've been on, because I think it delivers a bit of context for the work that we're doing with 2030 Yea. You know, a lot of you, I think, are privileged to live in a region where there's general consensus that we are transitioning, and we are going to benefit from that transition. And generally speaking, everyone agrees where we're going. Unfortunately for me, living in the Latrobe Valley and starting a solar business in the valley, there was a long time there where I really started to doubt my own beliefs and my passion that we could actually get somewhere. So, you know, I've been in the industry since I was 19, and I didn't finish year 10, and I never really had a lot of prospects as a kid. So if it wasn't for renewables, I don't know where I'd be. But I've always believed that this world needs to transition, and that we should be, because it's just good for the environment, good for the economy, and it just makes sense. Yeah, I came down to the Latrobe Valley in 2010 with a head full of confidence and altruism, thinking I'd change the world, and was pretty quickly hit with a lot of hostile opinion, a lot of Luddites, and a lot of people that just didn't see the way forward. So it's been a challenging 10 years down here, 12 years. We built our business from the 3rd bedroom of our family home in a little town called Merboo North, 2,000 people up on the ridge in the hills of Gippsland. Great place to live, but not a great place to start a renewable energy business surrounded by 4 coal-fired power stations. So yeah, we've been on a journey. I think from 2015 onwards, we've seen a tremendous shift, the social impact elements, you know, really started to cut through, and we've been able to show the way forward with apprenticeships and employment and opportunity. So just a couple of key moments for us in the Valley. I think, 2015, we installed the first EV charger when we purchased a Tesla in the Latrobe Valley, which isn't a big deal now, but back then when you installed an EV charger in the Latrobe Valley, we had a conga line of politicians turning up. I think it must have been election time, and we had the shooters, farmers and fishers, we had the Nationals, we had the Australian Motoring Enthusiast Party, the Greens. It was a broad church. I think that's when I started to realise that there is going to be political winds are going to blow the other way, and we will start to have some wins in the valley. So that was a tremendous step forward. We've been very heavily involved in advocacy, working with the Energy Minister and the state government. Have done a fantastic job in the valley. We've had a couple of really good wins over the last few years, and particularly our largest ever system being in the Latrobe Valley, which is 1.4 megawatts on the Latrobe Regional Hospital in Traralgon, and also installing solar on the Latrobe City Council's headquarters, and then putting out a press release saying we did this to reduce our energy bills, which I think, from a messaging point of view in the valley was very important. So, we built up our business from nothing in 2010, and in the end, we were acquired by RECV in late 2019. We had about 80 staff at that time. I've now stayed on as the CEO of RECV Solar. We've made some acquisitions. We now have 175 employees, including the largest in-house workforce in the country, installers, project managers and engineers. So we're making big investments because we can see where we're going and we want to be a part of it and be a real force. We're on a tremendous journey, and there's a lot more to go still. These are just some of the early days. My first office out in the backyard, our first team photo in 2014, first EV charger in 2015. This is the 1.4 megawatt system in the valley that we delivered. And then that's where our team ended up by the time we were acquired by RECV. So I'm really proud of my team and the people that we've been able to bring with us along the way. And just very quickly, some of the investments that RECV is making in renewable energy, for those that aren't aware, it's not always a logical progression for RECV to be in the energy space, but they believe, like a lot of you do, that the electric vehicle is that intersection between the home, energy and transportation mobility, which is, for RECV being a motoring body, now making big investments in energy. We think that when the electric vehicle is also the thing that you charge up and deliver power to your home and your business, that we're going to be well positioned to capture that market. And we've made a lot of investments in electricity retail. So we have a retail license now. We're installing large scale storage to seed our own virtual power plant across all of Victoria. We have a bunch of electric vehicles in our fleet. We've made some investments in electric vehicle charging software and hardware, and also Hyzon, who build tow trucks and buses, which will be fueling with green hydrogen. So I believe there's a niche role for green hydrogen to play in the future of our energy system. These are just some of the big projects we're delivering. To give you an example on a large scale of what can be done, this is the largest solar and battery installation in the country behind the meter on Australia's largest private shopping centre. So this is about a $15 million project. And the thing that I think is interesting about this is that the shopping centre didn't install the solar. They just rent us the roof and some car parks, and the customers, the tenants, buy the energy from the system. And another interesting thing, it was actually funded by private equity. So I think it shows that although I, and I'm sure a lot of you, do this because we care about the environment, the smart money is going into renewables. And that's a really powerful transition that is going to make this momentum unstoppable. Homes are going TAFE. We also get involved heavily in training. That's our first female apprentice there, Mel Curtin. We delivered a solar system for Holmesglen and created a training program to accredit renewable energy warriors who are coming through wanting to get into the renewable energy field. And as a result of this project, we've written a program, and we're actually offering employment to some of the really standout students that are coming through the program. So taking a commercial project and using it to create generational change and opportunity, I think, which is a really important thing on this journey. We also do a lot of social housing type work with microgrids, which I think we all know that one of the biggest problems with this transition is that it does leave people behind, and it is widening the gap. So we need to find ways to bring everyone with us on this journey and lower everyone's electricity bills, not just those that can afford a solar and battery on their home. And solar in the regions, which brings us to the some of the work we're doing in Yea. This was a $1 million donation by RECV to install solar and battery storage across 28 facilities in regional Victoria. It was born out of the bushfires on Black Saturday, Black Summer. We decided to donate these solar and battery systems with a generator to provide reliable electricity in the event of an emergency. So we started with the most heavily affected regions up in Tallangatta in the northeast and in East Gippsland. And then we've now gone out into other areas that are increasingly bushfire prone with climate change becoming an issue. And we're donating these systems and operating, maintaining them, just making people feel comfortable that they have their own autonomous, reliable energy supply. So I think it shows that although we're trying to grow a business and be commercially viable, that we actually do care about what we do, and social impact is at the heart of our business. Some of the work we're delivering in Yay so far, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. So these systems were part of the Solar in the Regions program. So we donated a 22 kilowatt system with 48 kilowatt hours of battery storage and a generator to the Yay Rec Reserve, the showgrounds. So we designed this to supply the kitchen for cooking meals, hot water obviously for showers, and light and power circuits in the event that there is a loss of electricity in an emergency to the Yay township. We did a similar system next door for the CFA staging area, very similar purpose. The Yay Men's Shed, we've delivered solar and battery storage to them as well to also provide them with the reliable electricity. And the Yay Butter Factory, which also has an electric vehicle charger, and a lovely juxtaposition of new and old there, I think, taking a beautiful old building and turn it into an energy powerhouse going forward as well. And then after all of those things, we had the Yay Community Day, which I hope some of you were at. The way I would probably describe the Yay Community Day is it was one of those days where it makes you realise that we might not always realise it, but we're in the middle of a revolution. And there are a lot of people on board. There's a lot of good ideas, a lot of investment, and a lot of social license, and we're making a big difference. So it was a day that was full of positivity. It showed me, although there are challenging days along the journey, that overall we're getting there, and we need to take this momentum. We need to keep driving it. So politically, economically, socially, we've just got to keep our foot on the accelerator. We can't afford to slow down because there's too much work to do, and we really should have started a long time ago. And I just wanted to finish off with a story about Nick. So I believe that I like to talk about Nick as the face of the energy transition because it means a lot to me. Nick's just a great kid. Was a cadet as a young fellow, came into our business as an 18-year-old wanting an electrical apprenticeship. He actually did his pre-apprenticeship at Loy Yang Power Station in the Latrobe Valley. His dad got him some work experience in the power station. But he said to him, I'll give you a taste of the workforce, but you need to understand that your future is not in the coal-fired power stations. You need to get into renewables if you want to be an electrician in the Latrobe Valley in the future. I think it's a lovely story because it talks about his dad's ability to see past his own bias, and everything he's ever known in his life and his career. He was still encouraging his son to capture opportunities by shifting out of traditional coal-fired generation into renewables. And I just think it's a real sign that if we can create more Nicks, especially in the Latrobe Valley, but right across Australia, that we can bring people with us on this journey, and the way forward is tremendously prosperous, better for the environment, and we're all going to have a lot of wins. So hopefully it sets the scene, some of the amazing work that we've done with the team at 2030. I want to thank Yay and the Yay community and Claire and Elaine, and I'm sorry, apologies if I missed anybody else, but the work you're doing at the moment really inspires me, and just to play a small part in your journey is a real pleasure. And I thank you for the opportunity to present tonight, and look forward to hearing Saul's presentation.
Well, Andy, thank you very much indeed for the most informative comments, and thank you indeed on behalf of the Yay community for the generous contribution you've made. It certainly is making a difference to this town. A vote of thanks really both to you, but also to RACV Solar for what is being done in that regard in and around not only this town and region, but elsewhere. But certainly it is a landmark development in this town, and we appreciate it. So moving on though, we'll come back if there are any questions for Andy later after we've had the talk. And so as advertised, our other speaker tonight is Dr. Saul Griffith. Saul, and variously on websites and so on, is described now as an Australian American. He is a graduate, though, of the Universities of New South Wales, of Sydney, with engineering degrees from there, but he also does have a doctorate's degree from MIT in the US. And my understanding is he currently lives in the US, but I think
No, I live in Wollongong.
So the websites are out of date, are they? Anyway,
almost certainly. I have a lot of websites, and a lot of them are out of date.
They describe you as a resident of San Francisco, but maybe that's for the past. Just briefly, though, Saul is described as many things, really, but as an inventor, as an author, a founder of multiple companies, and he's led some very major projects for major American agencies. And I won't go through that because we really want to hear from Saul. But the reason that was attracted to us to invite Saul to present tonight was he's recently written, I think it was released here in Australia in February, a book called The Big Switch, Australia's Electric Future. And really, this book provides a detailed blueprint for fighting climate change. So it's really a great pleasure on behalf of 2030 Yea and also of the Yea Wetlands Discovery Centre to invite you, Saul, to deliver the presentation tonight. So thank you very much indeed. And over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Andy for the introduction. In many respects, all I'm going to do is tell you the story that Andy just told you with a few more graphs. This transition is happening, and it can be a good thing. So thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks for Andy for introducing with the real on-ground action that's happening in Australia. Thanks for the kind words. Just to update my resume quickly, I did all of my studies in Australia as an undergraduate. I then promptly bought a one-way ticket to America to the chagrin of my mother, studied overseas. I still remember she cried when she was dropping me off at Sydney Airport and said something to the effect of, "You'll meet a loud-mouthed, fat-ankled American girl and I'll never see my grandchildren." When I met my wife, I knew pretty much immediately she'd be my wife. So I called my mother and said, "Well, at least she doesn't have fat ankles." Despite all that, my mother is now getting to see her grandchildren because I've just relocated in the last year to Australia to live in Wollongong. I was living in San Francisco. Over the last 20 years in San Francisco, I've built about 12 technology companies. 3/4 of those are in energy, in wind, 2 wind companies, 2 solar companies, a 3rd solar company about to happen, I think, some energy storage companies, and then some activities in robotics. So my day job is inventing technology and turning that as an entrepreneur into technology companies in Silicon Valley. Through a lot of that work, because a lot of the early work for those technologies was funded by the Department of Energy, I was sponsored to work with the Department of Energy to map all of the energy flow through the US energy system at an unprecedented level of detail in order to create tools that people could use to plan this energy transition and see what are the likely pathways. That resulted in this book called Electrify. That came out in 2020 with MIT Press. That was in essence a book that I wrote for the incoming president for the US. I didn't know it was going to be Joe Biden at that time, but this is what the American president would need to do to keep the world on track for 1.5 degrees. Then COVID and all the other things happened. Biden got elected. It doesn't look like America's quite as on track for climate action as we need. So when I moved to Australia, I wrote this book, realizing that actually Australia, because of its natural advantages, is poised more than any other country in the world. Really, the big switch was in some respects written for whoever is going to be the incoming government after this election, in terms of a plea for what Australia could do to lead the world and in fact dramatically increase global action on climate mitigation, because Australia, the economics are going to work here first and work here most handsomely. So with that, I'm going to go to our slideshow. To that effect, I founded an organization called Rewiring Australia. I also founded one called Rewiring America. Rewiring America actually advises, among other people, a host of senators. We started the first Senate electrification caucus in the US. We talked to the White House about policy. We help analyze and advise on policy like the Build Back Better and the climate provisions that are actually looks like they're going to have a chance again at getting up in the US, which is good news. But Rewiring Australia is largely founded for the same reason, prosecuting the economic and the scientific argument for rapid action on climate change. A journalist from The Atlantic in the US actually described my book, Electrifying America, as the abundance agenda. And I think that's a nice change from 50 years of environmentalism where the solutions were less and smaller and colder. Whereas I think the argument of electrify and also the big switch is we actually succeed here through abundance, an abundance that saves us money, improves our lives, and gives us abundant, honestly, the cheapest energy that humanity has ever seen. So what does that abundance agenda look like for Australia? It's getting to zero emissions climate-wise. It's creating lots of good jobs, like that job of Nick's you just saw introduced by Andy, in our communities, spending money in our communities. It's revitalizing community economics, because if you're spending money, if the solar is being generated on the local clubs that you saw in Yay, that's energy that you're not purchasing from outside of Yay. So that improves economics for your communities. And ultimately, this does save money for our households, and will save a lot of money for our households if we, as a nation, build the right regulatory and finance environment to enable the future that I'm about to describe to you to happen. Brief pause. Also, it's a little hard via video, but I don't love talking to myself. If I say anything terrible or you have a burning question, I encourage people to unmute and scream, and we'll answer it in the middle of the chat. So the IPCC and urgency. I think it's important to put Australia and the community and your household in the context of this climate science that we hear about. So climate science is an emissions problem. This is a big detailed graph, but it's a fairly simple point. This is the emissions that count for Australia when we report to the IPCC. So everything above the dotted line are counted as our emissions. Everything below the dotted line is fossil fuels that are dug up in Australia but are burned overseas, and they count on somebody else. I divided the above the line, so our domestic economy, into two categories. Emissions that come from things that we do in our domestic economy, running our households, running our small businesses, manufacturing things, and then trade emissions. So these are emissions that go on the Australian people's budget, but actually is energy and carbon produced, making the export products that you see on the bottom. You might wonder why I've put green, orange, and red here. Green says that these household emissions, these commercial emissions, these are things for which we have technologies that are ready to go right now. Orange are things that are under development right now that don't actually work yet, aren't economic yet, aren't at scale yet, but might be solutions for the future. So that's things like hydrogen in its various forms for niches. It's things like negative emissions technologies. But green is things that we know that work right now. Red is emissions that we can only eliminate, very bluntly, by eliminating our fossil fuel industry. The reason to emphasize this is I think there's the biggest challenge for Australian climate politics is that we've defined climate politics for the last 3 decades about these red things, the fear of what we have to lose. And we're focusing on what we have to lose. To a lesser extent, we're focusing on miracle things that we hope might work, these orange things, and a lot of the political conversations are where are the hydrogen hubs going to be and where are this and that going to be. But we are missing the opportunity to heavily invest in the green things that we can do right away that actually help us hit our emissions targets. So to translate that into everyday experience, let's put it in the context of the IPCC's, this is called an emissions reduction trajectory. So this number here is 40. That means we're emitting about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year as a planet or as a species right now. The pathways, these are just various models that they have for different ways we could react. P1, P2, P3, P4. You see that P1 and P2, these are called low overshoot. That means we only go a tiny bit over 1.5 degrees, but and so a little bit of negative emissions later this century gets us to keep the cap on growth and keep us under 1.5 or at 1.5 by going over a little bit and then bringing it back down. P3 and P4 rely on huge amounts of negative emissions. You can see this is minus 10 billion tons and this is minus 20 billion tons. Let me just put those in perspective. 10 billion tons is the total amount of coal, oil, and natural gas that the whole global fossil fuel industry pulls out of the ground every year. So to imagine that by later this century, we will be putting that much carbon dioxide back into the ground is to imagine that we're going to create an industry as big as the 3 biggest industries of humanity, the fossil fuel industries today, and pushing as much stuff in the ground as they currently pull out. Yet that stuff will have almost no value compared to what the stuff is coming out. This is just not likely to happen. So realistically, you have to stay on these P1, P2 pathways. They're our only viable pathways. Another way of saying that, and you hear it, is fast and early emission reductions are vital. This chart is why you get the 50% emission reductions by 2030 statements. That was a miracle when Biden announced that on his first day in office as the new US target. It was the first science-based target by a major emitting nation. And it is a target we should be shooting for. If you remember those green, ready-to-go technologies today, orange, things that are maybe going to start working at scale next decade, and red, negative emissions from the earlier slide. Realistically, the thing that we know how to do today, end-use electrification, that's electrifying our cars, electrifying our homes, electrifying our businesses, electrifying industry, deploying renewables, less so in Australia, but overseas also deploying nuclear. That gets us our first 75% of emissions. They're the things that we know how to do today. We need to do those immediately as fast as possible to stay on this trajectory. So we buy ourselves enough time to develop the technologies for the harder to abate sectors, as they call it: air travel, beef, agriculture, refrigerants, steel, aluminum, cement. Sorry, I mangled aluminium, even though my first degree was in metallurgy, because in Australia I was trained to say aluminium, and when I got to America I was trained to say aluminum, and now I'm just confused. So let's go back to that early part of that curve. I now want you to think about your community in the next 20 years, eliminating all of its emissions, because that's what's required if we're going to stay on target for a 1.5 and realistically for a better 2 degree world, given that other nations will take longer than we will. Here's that same curve, and what I'm overlaying here is the lifetime of our water heaters. Water heaters last about 10 years. Our kitchen appliances last about 12 years. Our space heaters last about 15 years. Our cars last about 20 years. If you never bought a petrol or diesel car in Yay again, this purple line is the rate at which petrol and diesel cars will retire from your community. What this really says is that to stay on our emissions, the required emissions target, is we need to make sure that every time anyone in Australia buys a water heater, a new kitchen stove, something to heat their house, or a car, it needs to be an electric one of it, and it needs to be powered by renewables. That's called 100% adoption rate. That sounds pretty intimidating, but I actually gave a talk like this to a community group like yours. And a really beautiful email came to me that said roughly the following. It was from a gentleman who said that he sat down with his family and he pledged with the family to get to 2025. Not hugely high income or anything, it's just an average Australian family. And I loved the story. He said, we're going to get solar now, financed because the government is helping provide finance to reduce the upfront burden. And by doing that, they immediately start their emissions reduction. Then he was going to electrify the stove and the water heater over the next 2 years. He was doing that because he anticipated that by 2024, the battery prices will have dropped and they'll have better economics. And in 2025, they will upgrade their petrol car to an electric car because the prices will have come down and the choices will be higher and there'll be more supply in the secondhand market. After that, he's banking and composting and eating well and consuming responsibly is the remainder of their emissions. But I actually think as a story, we often hear, I think, oh, you have to get to zero emissions, and people think that they have to do it tomorrow. But I think more realistically is over the next 20 years, everyone's going to buy a new car anyway. Everyone's going to buy a new water heater anyway. Let's just get in the mindset of, this year I'll buy an electric bike because I could afford to lose a little bit of weight and ride the kids to school. Next year, buy the car, then buy the switchboard, then the rooftop solar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if every household makes a plan like that, and you lay all of those plans over each other, every plan being a little bit different, there is the secret for Australia hitting its climate targets and leading the world and showing the world how to do it. That requires community plans, and perhaps we'll talk about this later. Part of the mandate that we've given Rewiring Australia is to try to get the world's first pilot to prove that this recipe works for a real whole community, which means about 1,000 households all under the same substation, converting to this suite of technologies and proving that the technology works, proving that the household and community economics works, proving out the social license, building out the capacity, the supply chain, the labor, certifying and training enough people like young Nick to actually get this job done. And then very critically at the end there, fixing the regulations and the policies in the country that are slowing this down or making it artificially expensive. All right, so to return to the household and the good news story. 42% of the emissions that happen in our domestic economy are emissions that happen around your decisions that you make around your kitchen table. What fuel is in your car? What heats your home? Where does your electricity come from? Meaning, where are you purchasing it from? Is it renewable or is it not? And how are your various fuels made? If you include small businesses as decisions that are also made around the kitchen table, it goes up from 42 to about 60 or 65% of our emissions. This is the biggest whack of the emissions that the Australian people can control, and the ones that technologies now exist, so you don't have to imagine a solution. They're already in the marketplace. I think this is critical, and I'm hoping and lobbying hard that the next incumbent government, and I'm talking to both all the teams here, I hope that we can recognize that our homes or our castles are in fact our infrastructure. The 20th century version of infrastructure is dams and roads and bridges and transmission lines. Because the majority of our emissions end in the home, and because we need to focus on the end use electrification, so electrifying all the machines you see here, we need to understand that our homes are in fact part of the national infrastructure. This is an Australian home today. We use petrol and diesel to power the 1.9 vehicles in the average driveway and a whole bunch of toys. We use natural gas for a whole bunch of the heating things, whether that's hot tubs, hot water, heating your house, or cooking. And unfortunately, a lot of the electricity we get comes from coal. And in fact, nationwide, about 40% from black coal, 12% from brown coal. You can see Victoria up in the top right-hand corner there. You're either better or worse than New South Wales. At least you're slightly less coal than us. We're about 3/4, but you are more brown coal, which is dirtier. So to really be simple about it, we've got to do two things to get to zero emissions in our communities. We've got to electrify the demand side machines. That's what's historically been ignored in the Australian climate debate. And we have to supply it with clean electricity. That's what is in the Australian climate debate. Electrifying the demand side machines is a much simpler recipe for fixing our climate problems than has been historically stated by the environmental movement. The recipe is simple. Electrify the 2 vehicles, or the 1.9 vehicles, electrify the water heating, the space heating, the kitchen, solar on your roof, because that'll be the cheapest electricity you can get, battery on the side of the house to help balance it all. Probably have to upgrade this switchboard or fuse box or main panel, depending upon what you call it. It's called something different everywhere. And then connecting yourself to the grid for the balance of your electricity. In addition to those things, we have to make sure that the electricity that's coming from our transmission lines, because we can't actually realistically island our communities if we want robust and reliable energy, we need to make sure that it's wind, solar, and hydroelectricity that's backing up our community and household generated electricity via the transmission grid. The amazing thing about this, if you model energy systems, is that it's going to cut your energy in half, in addition to improving your health, because you won't be burning carcinogens inside your house. It'll improve your quality of life because there'll be less noise, less carcinogens, and it will also lower your energy bills. So how does that work out? On the left over here is a traditional petrol car. You put the petrol in, about 20% of the energy in that petrol is used to move the car. For 50 years, we've been championing efficiency. And in fact, that was the answer to the 1970s oil crisis in the US. That's why America has fuel economy standards. That's why they're adopting electric vehicles faster than us. But you can make cars slightly more efficient, and it only marginally changes this picture. If, however, you electrify this vehicle, it uses about 1/3 of the energy of the petrol vehicle for the same kilometer traveled. That same 2/3 discount is true if we go from traditional natural gas water heaters. We can make them marginally more efficient. They're already close to 90% efficient, so it's hard to squeeze much more out of that. If we go to electric heat pumps, they will use 1/3, or even in Australia's mild climates, 1/4 of the energy of their gas-powered equivalent. That's also true. This is a sketch of a natural gas heater for a centrally heated house. This is a heat pump or a split system, as Australians might know them. The heat pump split systems use 1/3 of the energy of the natural gas for the same amount of heating inside the household. And the last huge, the savings aren't limited to that. It's also in the kitchen. This is a natural gas cooktop. 3/4 of the energy is wasted. If you electrify it, especially if you use electric induction, it'll use about 50% of the energy of natural gas to cook the same meals. Finally, and the biggest energy saving in Australia is the profligate waste of the way we currently generate our electricity on the grid. This is a coal-fired power plant. I may as well personalize it and say in the Latrobe Valley, Australia's coal plants waste about 75% of the energy in the coal in converting to electricity. This is a natural gas plant. Net, the Australian fleet is only about 60 or 70% of the energy is lost as waste heat. It's waste heat that you see in those steam clouds going up into the sky. Over on the right, if we generate our electricity with solar and wind, they do not generate that same waste heat. We do not lose that energy. And in fact, once again, 2/3 less energy to achieve the same goal. That gives you this incredible picture for the average Australian household. On the left here is how the average Australian household uses energy today. 102 kilowatt hours per day for the 2.7 people in that house, broken down in the following way. Dark gray is diesel, silver is petrol, so that's driving all of our vehicles. Purple here is natural gas for space heating, water heating, and for cooking. And then at the bottom, the blue bit is the electricity we get at our meter on the side of our house, and the orange is the wasted energy in generating that electricity. The energy use will go down to 37 kilowatt hours per day for the same household doing the same activities, even though the electricity will triple from about 13 kilowatt hours today for the average house to about 37 kilowatt hours. But that is the huge win. The efficiency that we've always been looking for in the energy world is the efficiency of electrification. So this is really the story of why I don't want to say we can really have our cake and eat it too, but we could continue with the same sized homes in Australia, the same sized cars, and reduce our energy burden by this much through electrification. What are the economics of this transition going to be? This is your average Australian household today. They spend after taxes $80,000, and around $5,000 of that is on energy. That was in 2021 before Putin invaded Ukraine and sent price of coal and gas skyrocketing, and oil is probably going to be about $7,000 on average this year, which is the squeeze we're feeling on energy expenses. Yet more reason to subscribe to the program we're talking about here tonight. Of that $5,000, About $1,700 a year is spent on electricity, close to $3,000 on petrol and diesel, and about $700 on natural gas. And you can compare those things to the $7,000 a year on rent payments, or the $1,600 a year we spend on legs of lamb and sausages. These are the 5 quintiles. So each of these represents 20% of Australian households. The wealthiest 20% of Australian households spend about $2,500 a week. 4.5% of that is on energy. It's sort of a small amount that's manageable in those households. For our lowest income households, they're spending closer to 10% of their weekly expenditure on fuels. Absolutely to cheer and champion Andy's acknowledgement that we have to bring everyone along in this transition. That's important. Otherwise, it'll be a cultural wedge. It's important because you don't get to zero emissions unless everyone can afford it. We really need to be thinking about how to do it down at this end of the Australian electorate. And we also have to remember that the energy savings that we're about to talk about are far more impactful down here than they are up here. So quickly, when we can model the energy uses of a house, that's how we get this. We can also model the price of the future. Sorry to jump about a bit here. The price of technologies as they go into the future. So if you invent a new technology, that's learning through science. If a technology is already working, it gets cheaper every time you produce twice as many of them. That's known as learning by doing. This curve was originally called the Wright curve after the Wright brothers, tracking the declining cost of air travel every time we doubled the number of airplanes we built. It was then known as the Ford curve, tracking the declining price of cars as Ford doubled and doubled again. Manufacturing, you might know it as Moore's law, which is the reason computers got faster and faster and cheaper every time we double the number of them they make. And what you may not know is we also have a name for this curve for solar, which is called Swanson's law. And Swanson's law shows you here that every time, this is the log scale, so every time you go from one of these lines to the next, that's doubling the total global amount of solar made in that year. Every time we double it, the cost falls by 22%. Sorry, this one's a little fuzzy. I'm not sure why that is. Solar has got a 22% curve, wind is 14%, batteries are 20%, electric vehicles are 21%. We need, you can see here that where we are today is the amount of all of these things being made in 2022. That's 1x, 2x, 4x, 8x, 16x out here to the right. We need between 10 and 16 times the production rate that we currently have of solar, wind, batteries, and electric vehicles to get to the production rate we need to get the whole world to zero emissions. That tells you that just the project of solving climate change is going to lower the cost of all of these technologies by half or more in the next decade as we bring up all of these things to scale, given that solar and wind are already beating natural gas and coal just straight up in grid generated electricity. In fact, about more than 75% of global new generation capacity last year was renewable. It's going to get so much cheaper that this is really the phenomenon that is driving, it's game over for coal, and it's the death knell is knocking for natural gas now because this is just so cheap. If you model those price reductions into the things that we use in our everyday life, this is the picture for the Australian household. I'll go slowly to explain this. That first red bar is the energy expenditures in 2021 for the average Australian household, a little over 5,000. This dashed line here, $7,000, that's what it will be now that oil or petrol is $1.80 a litre. Instead of when we modeled it last year, it was $1.46. If you went out in 2022, this bar here, and you bought 1.9 electric vehicles and you financed them and had to pay the cost of that finance, if you bought the electric stove, the household battery, a 10 kilowatt solar system, all the things you need, you'd actually be spending more, about $10,000 or $11,000 a year on your total cost of finance plus energy. You'd only spend this little pink bit down here on the remaining electricity you're buying from the grid, but you would be spending more on finance. The good news, however, is the cars are getting cheaper and more numerous every year. So in 2023, the gap will be much closer. 2024, we're basically at the transition where this solution of financed solar, battery, electric vehicles, electric cooking, electric heat is cheaper than the current energy bills for the average Australian household. It gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and we can see out by 2032 that the average Australian, or 2030, the average Australian household is going to be saving $3,000 to $5,000 per year on their cost of vehicle ownership and the cost of energy. That is an extraordinary windfall for households, and shouldn't be underestimated. Sorry, again, I got some complicated charts. That's why Andy's talk was better, because it was shorter and he didn't try to bamboozle you with math. But this also tells a great story. So if we thought about the fact that these are a little more expensive these year for a few homes, but it won't be by 2024, 2025, we'd only need a cumulative investment of about $12 billion in Australian households, helping the early adopters to purchase those electric vehicles, purchase those household batteries, purchase those heating systems, that by 2025, that investment would start paying back as the whole country starts to save money. By 2030, the 11 million Australian households that there will be in 2030 will be saving about $45 billion a year collectively. This is the storyline that we hear from cynical politicians, that this transition is going to cost us money, is just a cynical lie. This is the recipe for saving Australia money. We just need to recognize the new infrastructure that is our households and enable this. To reduce it to how we're going to feel this every day, I think this is a better way of thinking about it. If you're driving a 10 litre per 100 kilometre vehicle today, it's going to cost you about 12 cents a kilometre to drive that vehicle. If you're charging a Tesla off the grid today, which is probably going to cost you 25 cents to 30 cents a kilowatt hour, it's going to cost you about 8 cents a kilometre. So even if you buy that Tesla today, it's cheaper every kilometre you ride, and that's how you can pay back the financing cost of the slightly more expensive vehicle. In 2025, electric car, solar, and enough battery to collect all of the solar on your roof and charge your car will be about 5 cents. But even today, if you have the patience to charge your car at home off your rooftop solar in Australia, which is 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour of electricity, it'll only cost you 1 cent to drive the same kilometer as this petrol car. This is underlying the fantastic transformation in household economics we can see when we electrify. Same is true with water heating.
Question.
Yep.
Enough grass. Sorry, question.
I love it.
Yeah, great, because I've had enough grass. How do we afford the electric cars? I know India is doing really cheap cars, but I don't understand how that will actually translate to Australia.
So this chart here will say, Tesla produced 1 million electric vehicles last year. In the US, they need 16 million cars a year. So that's why it's a good proxy for the world economy. About 16 times more electric vehicles will be built. And on the current rate of cost reduction, once we're making them all electric, they'll be less than half the price that they are now. And in fact, if you talk to Bloomberg Energy or Lazard Energy or these industry analysts, they now will indicate that the crossover point for electric vehicles being cheaper in the showroom, the sticker price, will be about 2025. So that's why you need to do this upfront investment now, right? Australia isn't subsidizing electric vehicles because we have a neoliberal government. California is subsidizing electric vehicles. That's helping people get there. But with those subsidies won't need to be there by 2025 because the cars are getting so much cheaper. In fact, when we modeled the household economics that you see here, the average price of the of 5 different manufacturers, electric cars in Australia was about $72,000. Then we did that 18 months ago. When we did the same analysis last week, the average price was about $54,000. So in 18 months, the average price of a new electric car came down that much. And part of that is because you can now buy a Hyundai Kona electric for about $58,000. You can buy a BYD T3 van for $39,000. All of the prices are coming down very quickly.
Sorry, Saul. If you ask me what a paracetamol per kilowatts is, I will actually let you know. I have no understanding what you're talking about when it comes to cars and the B's and the Ben's of the cars. I don't understand that. You're talking about America, is that right?
No, this is Australia. So electric car, if you took the price of the Hyundai electric and the Toyota electric and the Nissan electric and the Tesla electric in 2020 and a half in Australia, the cheapest ones were about $72,000 on average. If you do the same this year, it's about $55,000 on average. They're getting cheaper every year. It doesn't feel like they're cheap today. I agree with you. So that's why I was arguing we need to, like California and like Norway, subsidize the development of the early market and the early adopters so that it's not only the rich people who can afford those vehicles. Because already today, once you've got the car in your garage, if you can buy it, you will be saving money every kilometer. And this really is the general problem for this energy transition. Today, a fossil fuel machine, like a car, you can go and buy a $20,000 petrol car brand new. You can go and buy a $40,000 electric car brand new, but both of them are at the cheap end of the market. After about 200,000 kilometers, you'll have saved all the money back, or 100,000 kilometers, sorry, you'll saved all the money back on the difference on the electric car. So it's cheaper over the lifetime, but it's more expensive up front. It's cheaper over the lifetime to have an electric heat pump heat the water for your house. It's cheaper over the lifetime to heat your house electrically. Our challenge is that it's more expensive up front. And quite honestly, this is why a lot of the work that Rewiring Australia does is lobbying the various pretenders to be the new government to figure out the financing mechanisms to help all households afford these things so that we can meet our climate targets.
So I think we might, how much longer have you got to go with your formal presentation? Because we might finish that and then, because there are several questions, but it might be best to hold them to finish.
I can go, I'm pretty close here at this point. So I'll probably fly through in about 8 more minutes and then I can answer all the questions.
All right, so I think we'll let you finish your talk and then we'll throw it open because both here, but also just for the colleagues that are online, we are noting your questions and we'll come to those after we finish the formal talk. So
sounds good.
We'll see. Thanks.
All right, so these basically show you the same thing. Might be cheaper to buy a gas water heater today at $1,000. It probably costs you $2,000 for a heat pump, but it's 66 cents for a 5-minute or an 8-minute shower with natural gas. It's 6 cents for the same shower if you're running it off your rooftop solar, right? Similarly, for space heating, it's about a third the cost. Even boiling a cup of tea, you know, running it even off the current electricity grid, it's cheaper with an electric kettle than a gas tea kettle. So I'm going to really quickly go over this because I actually think this is where we try to put skin on bone, put flesh on the bones of this story. And what does this really look like in an Australian, an example community? I'm going to use Austin Mere because I live there right now, so it was easy for me to think about it, but it turns out that it's a pretty typical suburb. Austin Mere has about 2,500 people. Average age is just over 40. There's 1,000 households, 2.7 people per house, which is the Australian average, 1.9 motor vehicles per house, Australian average, slightly higher than average income, but about the average number of 80% are single family, standalone homes. It sits in 2515, which is our postcode, which is 6 similar suburbs that in total is about 4,500 households being served by the Wombara Zone substation, which is our local electricity substation. It takes electricity from the grid way out there and converts it to 11,000 volts that's delivered to all of those 4,500 households on these purple lines. Currently, all the energy comes from coal. And it's almost extremely stereotypical of an average Australian substation in that it serves those 4,500 households on 4 to 5 strings, about 1,000 households per string. What you'd like to do is prove the remaining resistance from the Australian energy companies is they will tell you that you can't balance the voltages on these strings or the phases, which is really just an excuse for not. Most people I know who actually install electric vehicles, install solar, install batteries, know that we can manage the electricity below here. And this is the reason that Australia should be piloting a whole suburb to prove to ourselves and to the world that this is the recipe for economic success. Here's the Wombara substation electrical load in 2020, 2021. So in the middle of winter, it's about 4 megawatts, that black line. The gray is the daily variation. In the middle of summer, we use about half the electricity. You can see there in January and February, about 2 megawatts. The data is great. You can see a really hot day here. We don't have a huge number of them in Ostermere. That 40-degree day accounts for this rise in electricity to run our air conditioners. These 2 cold days in August and September result in this increased heating load. So you can see that. This is that same chart I showed you earlier about how we're going to reduce the amount of energy by 60%, but increase the amount of electricity by about 280%. That increase manifests itself like this. When we electrify all the cars, we electrify all the heat, we're going to about 250% more electricity. So we go from that black line to that red line. The good news about that is that the seasonal variation is much smaller proportionally, because now it's about 6 megawatts in the summer and 7.5 in the winter. So the variation is smaller. This is helpful to us later. The cheapest electricity that we know is the stuff that Andy can install on your roof, which is the rooftop solar or community solar, because you avoid the 15 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour for the transmission lines to bring you these other renewables. So we're going to maximize that, but still use a little bit of these other renewable sources. In our community, and this is the University of New South Wales and the Australian Photovoltaics Institute made an estimate of how much electricity you could generate for every single rooftop in our postcode. And it's about 74 gigawatt hours per year, which is actually greater than the 55 gigawatt hours a year, which would be the total load for a fully electrified postcode 2515. So in theory, we could make more energy than we can use. Problem with that, as you've all observed, is that we get about twice as much solar, 6 kilowatt hours for each square meter of solar in the summer as we do in the winter, about 3. And that correlates to this picture. If you took our postcode 2515 and we had 100% of rooftop solar penetration, we'd easily produce close to double the amount of energy we need for everything we do in January, but we'd be short a little bit in July and August. This is why we need to not imagine islanding communities, but doing as much rooftop solar penetration as we can, because that's the cheapest, but connecting ourselves to the Australian grid because it's always windy somewhere and it's probably sunny somewhere else. And that helps us fill in these gaps. Here it is. That's just restating the case. That's how we make it the cheapest. Now I just want to speak before I finish about what this will mean for a community like Yea. I think Andy said that the town he lives in has 1,000 households. So it's in fact very much like Ostermere. Today, average Australian house or average household in Ostermere spends about just under $5,000 a year. $1,000 of that goes to the grid via your electricity bill. $3,400 of that goes overseas to a foreign producer of oil. It creates precious few, maybe one job in the community at the local petrol station, and $334 of it is in natural gas that leaves again, doesn't make any jobs in the local community. A little bit of money goes to buying and purchasing the solar and the electric vehicles. Some of that goes to finance. About $21 a year for each household goes in labor, hiring people like Nick to put that solar on the roof, and it saves about $2 a year for that household compared to buying it, for the average household compared to the grid. What could we do tomorrow? So if we get to all electrified, the 2 electric vehicles, the solar, the heat pumps, etc., we no longer send the money out of the community to buy oil. We no longer send the money out of the community to buy natural gas or coal. We do still spend about $1,000 for the grid electricity. We spend a lot more on buying upfront those vehicles, a little bit of it on finance. But the really good news story is there'll be about $350 per year per household in local labor installing these things. There'll be about $4,000 a year in money saved per household by virtue of not sending the money outside the community. So that's good news for the household, but if you add it up, today we spend close to $15 million a year in 25-15 buying fossil fuels, mainly the gas and the oil. We spend close to a little over 4 million buying our electricity from coal. What we could be doing in 2030 is still spending that 4 million on grid electricity, but it will be wind and solar. We'll be spending $1.4 million dollars a year in local electrification labor. That's employing people like Nick, 25 new jobs generated in the community from that. And if you use standard economic techniques to calculate what would happen if the community was spending that $21 million they were saving elsewhere in the community, that would create a further 400 jobs. Another way to think of it is in a community of 1,000 households, or sorry, this is actually 4,000 households, it's hard to spend $21 million a year. You run out of surf lifesaving clubs, you run out of community centers, you run out of bolos that you can build because after the first 5 years, you've built all the classrooms and things you need. So this is the opportunity for Australia, if you think about it at community level, is for unprecedented economic renewal of our communities. Or as a senator that we work with in the US on our electrification caucus said, this is going to be the largest wealth transfer in history from the traditional providers of energy or producers of energy to the traditional users of energy. And that's what's going to drive this incredible economic story for Australian households. And with that, I'll stop and go to questions.
Okay, well, Saul, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I note we do have 7 questions coming in at the moment, or comments, but we'll take a few on from the floor first. So we'll take Rosemary first, please. Yes.
I'm wondering, Saul, we built our industrial rail house totally off grid. For heating, we had the wood-fired stove, and for heating and cooking. Is that still a dirty energy, the wood fire?
Yes and no, which I'm not hedging. Yes, for local air quality reasons, burning wood creates particulate matter that we know causes respiratory illnesses similar to burning any of the fossil fuels. In a high population density city like San Francisco or Sydney, they in fact are limiting the number of people who can install new wood-fired heating systems. In San Francisco, they actually have what they call clear the air days, where the air pollution quality goes up so high during the winter because people are burning their wood smoke and it's sitting down low to the ground that they encourage people to stop burning wood. In reality, burning wood, especially from felled, if you have a reasonable property, I think the 3 acres you can fell sustainably the 4 cords of wood a year that heat a home in a cold climate. I just sort of remember a cord of wood is a pile 4 foot high, 4 foot wide, and 8 foot long. And that's a pretty cold climate. So that's probably more Tasmanian than Yay. But in a community like yours, and I was fortunate enough to visit there only a few months ago, the population density is as low, almost certainly there won't be enough concentration build up from, even if everyone had a wood-fired heating system, from it wouldn't really create a huge air quality problem in Yea. Burning wood certainly helps you fill in that gap in the winter that I showed you that there will be, because there's more, there's less sunshine producing the solar in the winter. And so it's not, the great thing about wood is it's the ultimate battery. It takes summer sunshine, stores it in wood for you. So perhaps I'm really being apologetic for my wife here, who loves a wood fire. I tried to go to an all electric household and she said, up to the point that you can't take away my lovely, warm, romantic wood fired fireplace. And so I've had to figure out how to narratively say that it's okay and it can be zero emission if you do it well.
Thank you. Talk at the back. Thank you for the question.
I think at the moment we've got to convince more people of the wisdom of this, because if you see all those houses that are being built in the north side of Melbourne now, they get their classification that they're an energy efficient home, even though they only put in one panel for their electricity. They only put the insulation in where they have to. They have very narrow eaves. We need to, I think, educate kids at school in what smart housing is all about, like energy efficient housing, because at the moment I think it's treated very cynically by the builders and the architects.
I think that's a bit more of a statement than a question, and I second your statement.
That is a question.
Yeah, I think Saul, I think the point of the question is educating the community, and especially the younger people, as to what is really an energy efficient dwelling.
I think the term is, I violently agree with you, and I see the new suburbs going up in outer suburbs of Sydney, and the homes are too close together. There's no eaves, like you say. There's no plant life providing cooling effect, and they all have crazy complicated roofs that have limited area that could be covered with solar. And I agree that the Australian building standards are not good enough in terms of double glazing windows, insulation in the walls, and even air sealing. And I agree with your statement that our building codes are cynical to start with, and then treated cynically by the people building the buildings. The reality about climate change, I have these numbers for the US. The US has 121 million buildings or households. Australia has 11. In America, there's what they call 1.5 million home starts every year. That means that on the 20 years between now and 2024, where we've got to fix this, only 10 or 20% of the homes in the US are going to be newly built. And that's really the only chance you have to do the really efficient insulation, because it's more expensive when you're doing it on the retrofit. That's also true in Australia, which is to emphasize your point. The time to make efficient buildings is when we build them. The time to design these buildings to naturally absorb as much solar as they can is when we build them. And we absolutely should have a far more aggressive national building quality code that acknowledges not only that they need to be more efficient, but especially that they should be gathering as much of the solar energy as the buildings could.
Next question from Olivia.
Thank you, Saul. Very informative and solid analysis. I've been working with the Shire. We have a target of net carbon neutrality by 2035. We emit 366,000 tonnes, 42% are agriculture, so related to farming. And so there's so much, 30% is transport. There's only so much that households can do, apart from, asparagopsis, which is that red microalgae that CSIRO has developed. What analysis, what information can you provide to help our Shire reach our target?
I like picking one fight at a time, and a fight that I can prepare for and know a lot about. And the fight that I'm prepared to pick with the, with myself, meaning I'm part of the Australian public, is that we now know how to do the electrification component. We know how to do that first large portion of our emissions. I do know a little bit about agriculture. I did my time on a sheep farm when I was a kid. I used to have to put the little rubber bands on them. And so, you know, that's when you're an 11-year-old boy and you're taking the balls off sheep, it impresses upon you. We don't have, apart from broadly adopted vegetarianism, we don't have a technology today that works. CSIRO has made progress with this seaweed that as a feed component that does look like it's having quite extraordinary emission reductions from at least cows. The emissions from our entire agricultural industry are on the Australian public, even though I think it's 60% of our beef and 70% of our lamb is eaten overseas. And that number increases every year because increasingly we are the bread basket and the meat basket, if you like, the butcher for Asia and the world. So one problem of our agriculture is, you know, are we taking those emissions for us or are we taking it for the rest of the world? Certainly when I drove from Sydney to South Australia recently and then down to Melbourne, the thing that has obviously done the most environmental damage to Australia over the last 200 years is obviously cloven-footed animals. And so I think this is a terribly difficult issue. It's a cultural issue. It's about food, which I think is the thing that is the last cultural issue that people will cling to. I'm hoping, honestly, that we focus on the household emissions now because we can do them, and then we throw science and culture change and everything at agriculture over the next decade, because I am quite hopeful that we will improve it drastically. But to prioritize trying to do that now when we don't have good technological answers over the thing that we do know how to do just seems like we're getting the cart before the horse.
Okay, Claire?
Andy, if you want to unmute yourself and us and go back to the building.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, sorry to dovetail back into the building. I was jumping in at the end of Saul's just to feed off that. But I think we're letting the builders off too lightly, to be frank. If there's one thing that rips my heart out as a business owner when I try and care about the environment as part of what we do, it's having a conversation with a builder and trying to convince them to take out their single panel 180 litre piece of crap hot water service that says Soul Hot Water on the box because it ticks the box for the sustainability code for the home. But we know that it's running off electricity for 11 and a half months of the year. So we need to improve the standards and the building code, but we also need to start putting our money with builders that deserve it. If they don't give a crap about the environment, they don't give a crap about long-term running costs for their customers, then we need to stop supporting those builders because the overwhelming majority could not care less. If they can save $1,000 on a rubbish quality solar PV, solar hot water system, whatever it may be, they'll take it invariably. So I think we need to start voting with our dollar. Even one of my staff wasn't able to switch out a rubbish quality solar hot water system and put in something at a higher standard. They said, we're going to install it. If you want to rip it out in a month's time, put your own system in, that's your responsibility. So that's the stuff that really bugs me, and we need to start affecting change at that level as well as through government policy.
We had a successful case in Australia with the certification and training program we did as capacity building program for rooftop solar, which started a few decades ago and really gave us the workforce. It's why we have 30% penetration in Australia. We, in addition to everything Andy said, we need to be training the front line of this fight for climate, and the front line is our tradies. And we need to do something similar to that certification training program for heat pumps, for hot water systems, for batteries, for vehicle chargers, because quite honestly, I'm living in a place that's not that different to yours, and I had to call 9 tradies before one would install the induction stove.
Interesting.
Saul, thanks very much for writing your book. I have a copy of it. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. The diagrams in it, when it goes to a reprint, as I'm sure it will, any chance of either making them colour or increasing the size of them, or doing both, please?
We've fought tooth and nail with the publisher about it. I'll ask them to do that, but what you can do is go to the Rewiring Australia website and you can get them all and make them as big as you want. And they're in,
Thank you.
And they can be in color. Some of them are still black and white, but we also got that feedback. The other thing that I will just warn you is I wrote the book Electrify, and someone came to me and said that they heard it on tape, and it was the first time I got the feedback that unfortunately the diagrams read terribly when you're listening to the book.
I'll take the next question, Claire. Elaine Furness.
Yeah.
Elaine, I hope you're well now and are recovering.
I wish I was there.
There
So a question that's sort of like a statement. So if we have to prioritise what we do in Yay as a renewables group, bulk buys for the demand side tools will be just as important as energy generation? Question mark? Yes?
Oh, absolutely. You also need to think about it as like, you have to electrify the demand side as fast as you create generation.
Yeah.
I mean, these things will always be in a bit of a race, but if you just did all generation now, you'd probably only generate up to the existing set of electricity bills. And this is the general problem with Australian policy. We have to be anticipating that 250% growth of the amount of generation. So we got to be doing these things together. It's the only way. And to be perfectly frank, I'd be a little bit more apologetic to coal if they would just subscribe to that program, because we're going to need all the electricity we can if we're going to decarbonize everything. And that's how you could have a saner, more just transition here. There's like, okay, coal communities, we're absolutely going to need you, national gas communities. Here's the 2035 or 2040 certainty date, but let's do both sides of this equation at the same time. Let's increase it. And certainly within communities, the thing that drives the savings for your community is the electric vehicle. So
is there another question in the room?
If you want to do the
Yeah,
most,
I've got another question.
Elaine gets two because she got me here.
That's right. That's right. Thanks to your mum. So Saul, could Yay be your pilot town? All things behind the one transformer.
I think that would be
you on the spot.
I think that would be fantastic. So we are trying to raise money to do a pilot, the first pilot, because, when I think of a pilot, it's 1,000 households. The first one, if you did in 2023, will require a $10 to $20 million subsidy because of all of those toys we're buying all of those households up front. But what you learn in doing that is you learn some of the certification and training things. You learn how the workforce development things. You learn how we're going to manage the voltages and how we're going to manage the phases underneath the distribution transformers. So anyway, that is to say, I'd love to do it in Yay. We have some political top-down suggestions that there might be some mostly state government level commitments to run multiple trials. So in fact, we've got loosely 7 or 8 loose commitments from 4 different state governments and a couple of generators. And there's every chance that Yay could be one of those communities.
Great. We know that Andy,
let's figure it out.
Andy does good training.
Another at the back, please.
Has he tried to tackle the car industry? Because at the moment, the standard work truck that most tradies have, you couldn't get a more inefficient vehicle if you tried, because they're four-wheel drive. They've got a huge space where you can't use the space in the back seat. So you've got this little tiny tray. And you just can't. I tried to buy a normal ute in the vision that we used to have them, and it's virtually impossible to get them.
It's my same friend in the back who disagrees with building code, and I agree with him there, and I'm going to agree with him again. Unfortunately, I have thought about it, and I would like a small ute that looks like the Toyota from a roughly 1974. It's probably 2-wheel drive, because you don't really need 4-wheel drive when it was as light as that one was. But unfortunately, these are the electric trucks that are coming over here on the right.
Yes.
So Elon Musk and others and Ford. So this blue one here is the Rivian. It comes with 135 and a 180 kilowatt hour battery pack as the options. A friend of mine just received his 4 weeks ago. It's $72,000 US. It has about a 500 or 600 kilometer range. but it weighs 2.5 tons. The Hummer down here weighs 3 tons. The unfortunate trend of the global automotive industry is to make them bigger and heavier. If you were sensible and you thought that, so the damage that a car does to the road, and ultimately we pay for the roads with our road taxes, and people are worried about how we pay for the roads when the petrol taxes aren't there anymore. The damage is caused by the weight of the vehicle. In fact, a car that weighs twice as much does more than 4 times as much damage to the road. So if you really wanted to have sensible vehicle policy in Australia and around the world, you would charge people per kilometre they drive, per ton of vehicle they drive. And so you'd have an economic mechanism that would try to rein in the automakers to make electric vehicles that are a little smaller and a little closer to what we really need. But I'm not personally think I'm going to win that battle. I think you're going to get these giant trucks over here. So sorry, mate.
Okay, one more question from
Yeah,
Cliff.
and I'll relay this one. Andy asks, will we have enough raw materials to make that many EVs?
We do globally, and in fact, Australia has found enormous resources of lithium in the past few years. Now we've started looking, and America is actually just east of Los Angeles, just found huge lithium reserves. It's pretty certain we can have all of the materials we want. It's still a lot of mining, but just to put it in perspective. So the second question someone asked after they asked that first question is like, what does it look like? I can tell you the following thing. Every Australian today has about 6,000 kilograms of fossil fuel pulled out of the ground for them every year and then burned, and it becomes 20,000 kilograms or 20 tons of carbon dioxide. If you electrified the Australian household, like I told you earlier in this show, half of the energy comes from solar, half of it comes from wind, and half of it comes from batteries. You'll need about, round figures, 50 kilograms of solar a year, 50 kilograms of wind power a year, and 50 kilograms of battery a year, because the reality is the batteries only last 10 years, the solar lasts about 20, and the wind lasts about 30. Most of those things are actually made out of recyclable stuff, so about 80% of it will probably be recycled. That means you only need about 10 kilograms of each of them every year. So on the environmental burden front, we have 20,000 kilograms of CO2 or 6,000 kilograms of fossil fuels currently for everyone every year. Over here in this future that is absolutely more sustainable, it'll be about 30 kilograms. It's a good news story.
Okay, we're getting near to the end, but before I thank the speakers, I just also want to thank a few other people. Claire Daly, thank you very much indeed for what you've done to help organise this particular session in the absence of Elaine Furness. You saw Elaine on the video there, and she is making a good recovery, as I understand, but it is going to be a long recovery. And if it wasn't for Elaine, we would not have this session, and so I want to acknowledge her contribution behind the scenes today, but she's been wildly...
A relentless lobbying.
Relentless lobbying.
If Elaine could fix this, if we could just have her lobbying Australian politicians, we win.
So, yeah, thank you for that. I want to acknowledge Adam Dennis is here, and he's been our IT guru tonight to get all this. And thank you, Adam. And I think it's worked remarkably well. And thank you for that. Don Knight, who is the chair of the Yea Wetlands Discovery Centre. Don has helped with the setup, the organisation, and so on. And so, Don, thank you for that. And Julie Blythe, who's not here, who is one of the Murrumbidgee Shire staff, but who's also the coordinator and the go-to person here. And Julie has been behind the scenes and with the promotion and so on, organisation. So without those people, it wouldn't have been possible. So I'd ask you first to thank all of those for the contribution that they've made. But finally, to our two speakers, Andy and Saul, thank you very much indeed for, I think, different, but indeed enlightening discussions. I think the thing that both throughout, in particular Saul, is a major challenge for us here in Yea. I think you've gleaned that we are making progress in Yea in terms of moving towards a more renewable future. But I think you've highlighted, Saul, that there's much more to be done. And I think, as you heard there from Elaine, we are a very willing participant in fact, assisting this very important transformation that needs to be made in terms of energy use in Australia. So finally, could we put our hands together to thank both of our speakers for such an insightful presentation. So thank you. But anyway, thank you all once again. And just finally, I should, yes, mention that in this series, we've been funded for 3 talks, and the final one will be on Friday, the 27th of May, again from 6 to 8 p.m. And it's about energy efficiency and sustainable communities. And we have 2 excellent speakers in Glenn Morris and Lucinda Flynn coming. So please enrol if you haven't already done so for our 3rd, and we look forward to seeing you again then. So thank you all.